Hello, friends. It's an honor and delight to be here with Simon Blackburn, who was professor of philosophy at the University of Cambridge. Until recently, he was Edna J. Curry Distinguished Professor of Philosophy at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And from 1969 to 1990, he was a fellow and tutor at Pembroke College, Oxford. His interests include metaphysics, ethics, philosophy of mind, and philosophy of language. I've read Professor Blackburn's works very closely. So it's a great honor to have this time to talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
So I just want to ask you two questions today that are very much on my and many of our minds. The first is, many of us find us in many moral predicaments in general, but now in particular. And we have trouble navigating them. And when we feel stuck, we can make a good case for either side. What do? Some look to authority, some look to faith. But when we feel stuck, how do we navigate that?
Right. Well, it may depend what the issue is. There are issues where we can agree to differ, where a unique solution may not be possible. As I'm sure you know, Kant had the concept of an imperfect duty. So you had to give money to charity, but to whom you give it and how much and at what intervals and so on, that's discretionary, relatively discretionary. So if my wife chooses to give money to Oxfam and I choose to give money to Save the Children, we're not necessarily disagreeing. We're each following our own path to obeying the imperfect duty. There are other things, of course, where the division is disagreement and we have to try and sort it out. I'm not a great fan of doing it by authority because, well, as you can imagine, it's going to be very easy to find authorities on two sides of any important division. So if you think about, I don't know, the right to bear arms in the USA, you can find authorities who say it's a inalienable right, it's there in the Second Amendment to the Constitution, and others who say, no, that's not how to read the Second Amendment, and it's not an inalienable right, and it causes a lot of deaths. So authorities can speak with two voices, just as in your head you can hear two voices sometimes. I think the only possible resolution, except time resolves some of these things, is dialogue. You've got to take a respectful view towards people who disagree with you, and you have to try and think it through, and dialogue is a way of doing that. If you can't find ground enough to hold a dialogue, then the other nasty way of settling those things is by fighting, by war or by civil unrest, by all the things that we are very familiar about in the conduct of people and states. So I think dialogue is far better than fighting. And it's important to try to find ways of conducting such dialogues. Not always easy, of course. We all know that many disputes are quite intractable. You only have to think of, for example, the Middle East, which I'm sure you're familiar with. And then perhaps we are thrown back on just saying, well, time will sort something out. We can't sort it out. Time will do it.
That's fascinating. So part of the answer when we feel stuck is actually to cultivate reason together and to be challenged and refine our thinking.
Yes.
I think that's fascinating, especially in isolating times like this where we might feel stuck, to pick up the phone, to work through problems. Sometimes we feel we have to resolve it ourselves, but we don't need an authority. We don't need an answer from someone, but we can receive challenge. Yes.
No, I'm afraid as an infidel, somebody with no faith, I can't believe there's a sky hook which enables some people to lock into the eternal word of God or whatever they might think it is. They'll be locking into a tradition, they'll be locking into a holy book which was written by somebody or other, which may help. They, like many self-help manuals, these things are useful. But they're no substitute, I think, for thinking it through yourself.
Yeah, great, thank you. So just one other question, a massive one, but any reflection you want to offer. I mean, we're in this pandemic, and it has led to chaos, systemic chaos in many ways.
Yeah.
and high anxieties. I wonder what you're noticing about human behavior from the reflection of philosophical or from
Mm.
ethics that
Yeah.
seem particularly troublesome, particularly exemplary, and how we can all take a step back to reflect on this moment.
Good. Well, I'm speaking, of course, from the UK perspective, where I think we've taken it a step more seriously than so far in the USA. But the immediate observation is that we find the best and the worst. The worst is people selfishly hoarding. They've tried to snatch as much as possible from the grocery stores. There are empty shelves. There are ludicrous shortages of things like toilet paper. People seem very concerned about. Although, as somebody else said, well, if the food runs out, you won't have all that much need for toilet paper. So, but that's the bad side. The good side is people have stepped up to the plate. There are lots of volunteers making sure that elderly people in the community who can't necessarily get to the shops are fed. There are the equivalent of soup kitchens, we call them food banks, which are springing up all over the place and help a lot of people. And by and large, people obey the government instruction, although it's not really backed by force of law because there aren't enough police to enforce it. But the government instruction to self-isolate, to keep yourself to yourself as much as possible. And that's been obeyed. I mean, we're a fairly obedient bunch in some ways. It wasn't obeyed this weekend, funnily enough, because Boris Johnson hadn't been fierce enough. He didn't say it was mandatory. He said, do please keep away from other people. But it was a beautiful spring weekend, and so everybody went to the beaches and they were crowded, which is very bad. That's not what the COVID virus needs. Well, it may be what the COVID virus needs, but it's not what we need in order to combat it. So I think best and worst, that's the obvious thing. How bad it's going to get, God knows. I mean, the financial problems are going to be with us for years, I think. A lot of major companies are either going to collapse or need huge loans and bailouts. And governments are going to have to try and do what they can. It's interesting, sorry, that in a crisis like this, it's funny how politics veers towards the left, the traditional left. Mm-hmm. State intervention, state action, the private equity, the private markets won't do it. They can't do it. So there's got to be state intervention, as there was in 2008, as a fairly liberal in the sense of left wing person myself. I'm not displeased to see that. I think it's a good corrective to the greed is good culture that we have heard so much of.
Indeed. Okay, thank you so much. Very insightful, Professor Blackburn. Thank you so much for your time and support.
Thank you very much.